Good morning, everyone. My name is Rya Stone, and I will be your host and presenter this morning for a mini webinar on how to handle political discussions at the workplace. So thank you so much for joining us today. I welcome everyone here. I'd like to start off by introducing the core members of our team that you'll be working closely with when you're working with us at ClickOnHR. First off, we have Elizabeth Fletcher, our HR manager based in Houston, Texas, and Hope Deanda, our wonderful HR assistant. And we have myself hosting this meeting this morning. If you have any questions at all, please type them in the chat box of the Q&A session, and Hope, our HR assistant, and I myself will get them addressed towards the end of this presentation. With 2020 presidential election right around the corner, political discussions and in many cases, debates are picking up steam. Let's be real, there's pretty much no upside to your employees talking politics at work. Now, we've all done the polite nod, pivoting to a work-related topic, or limiting the conversation with someone when we don't quite agree with them at work. However, this year, we're definitely seeing a surge in virtual harassment complaints, microaggressions, social media trolling, just to name a few. Just because our landscape has changed a little bit where we don't no longer have to do a polite nod to someone we don't have to listen to, doesn't mean that we're not necessarily maintaining a neutral status. So this is why it's such a hot button topic at the workplace for this quarter this year, because monitoring's become a lot more difficult too. Now, why can't we include politics as a topic of discussion at the workplace, especially if we have a civil and a respectful culture within a company? Makes sense, right? A lot of corporate cultures or even smaller companies have very open civil discussions. So why can't we have a civil discussion about politics? Well, if you are on the fence about whether political discussions are healthy or a good topic for the workplace, ask yourself these questions. 1, do you want to witness your team members debating potentially divisive hot button issues where emotions could run high and arguments could break out? In extreme and hopefully rare cases, could this escalate into physical altercations? It's something you have to consider. It's not unheard of in the workplaces. Do you think it's possible that some of your employees could feel uncomfortable or discriminated based on their coworkers or the content of coworkers' political discussions? Now, is that the type of work environment you want for your employees? So another important question to ask. Last but not least, do you want to expose your customers or clients to your employees' personal political beliefs, which has the potential to alienate them? Now, does this serve your business goals? So it always comes back to maintaining the best intent for your company, right? Chances are your answers to these questions support the argument that it's best to leave political discussions outside of the workplace. Now, regardless of your political leanings, there's one thing we can all agree on. Political harassment at work is unacceptable, and it must be prevented to avoid conflict and possible legal repercussions. So how do you minimize disruptive dialogue, maintain productivity, and stay within your legal boundaries? Good question, right? Now let me summarize the 2 main areas of risk or areas of exposures for employers surrounding discussing politics in the workplace that we just covered. In a nutshell, issue number 1, hiring or firing discrimination based on political affiliations, meaning, can you be fired for not having having a different political thought from your employer? The answer is, although political affiliation is not a protected class under federal law, it may be protected under state and local laws. So in some states, you cannot make adverse employment decisions based on whether an employee is for or against a political party, administration, policy, or issue. But under federal law, it is completely covered. You should be able to terminate an employee if your policy states that, if policy outlines accordingly what you will tolerate for, what you will and will not tolerate, basically. Now, the issue number 2 is harassment. So let's say you don't discriminate based on employment decision. Harassment for having different political thoughts. So illegal harassment can also occur when an individual is expected to endure the offensive conduct as a condition of employment, or the conduct is severe or pervasive enough to create an environment that is intimidating, hostile, or abusive. So as an example, a manager who repeatedly tells an employee or repeatedly tells a female employee, don't be so sensitive, in response to a complaint about overhearing an offensive discussion about women's rights, could open the door to a lawsuit. So 2 main areas, unlawful harassment, and discrimination based on employment or discrimination based on employment decisions based on political affiliations. So here are the things that we're going to cover today. One, we're going to talk about free speech. Can you discuss politics at the workplace? What are the laws? Two, should or can HR monitor these discussions? Three, what are employers' rights and how to manage them? So let's dive right into topic number one. Can employees discuss politics at the workplace? Kind of a loaded question, right? It brings us to the issue of free speech. It may surprise you to learn that our country's First Amendment right to free speech isn't protected in most private companies. In the United States, free speech isn't protected in most private companies, and in the United States, most citizens wrongly assume that freedom of speech entitles them to express opinions however and whenever they see fit. When it comes to free speech in the workplace, First Amendment protection only extends to public sector government employees. In most situations, privately held businesses can establish guidelines surrounding political discourses in the workplace or can intervene when the conversations go to risky territory, which we'll cover later in the webinar. Case in point, we have Chick-fil-A, or we have Hobby Lobby. Some of the, over the course of the years, we've heard of different company stances and how they're able to establish them. The First Amendment only protects each of us against government retribution for speaking our mind. It does not say anything about what private employers can regulate on the job. In fact, political speech and affiliation aren't federally protected at all. However, some states and municipalities do protect employees' political expression and the right to express political opinions. They even prohibit employers from discriminating against them on the basis of political beliefs and activity. So I highly recommend you check with the legal counsel to confirm where the locations are of your company and where you operate among them. I will share with you more information in the next slide, though, about this particular topic on what I've been able to present to you. Now, why is this so? While free speech is protected from state or government action, it's mostly not protected under private employers. That's because employees have First Amendment rights, but at work, private employers have a say-so first. So for example, what happens when an employee shows up to work wearing a #MeToo button or All Lives Matter shirt? Well, it depends on politics in the workplace laws for your state, your type of workplace, and the content of the political talk expression. However, the answer is generally yes, you have the right to ask them to take it off. So for private businesses in at-will employment states, if an employee does wear something political, you have the right to ask them to remove it and even terminate them if they refuse. The same goes for political discussions that get in the way of actual work responsibilities. So if you're a private employer, think about what really gets in the way of your day-to-day work, and that's probably where I would start thinking about when crafting your policies and presenting them to employees. So what are and aren't employers legally allowed to limit political discussions in the workplace? That's kind of an important topic too. In general, private employers have the discretion to limit political expression during normal work hours and on work premises. An exception to this is going to be National Labor Relations Act, NLRA, which prohibits employers from banning workers from discussing the terms and conditions of their employment, including salary and wages, along with minimum wage, paid leave, promotions, union activity, regardless of whether they're a member of a union or whether or not unions are active in the industry or area that you operate. These topics could very well be part of a political party's or candidate's stance, but these are also issues that are relevant to terms and conditions of employment. So some great areas to think about when crafting that policy is if it relates, again, we go back to the content of what this employee or employees are discussing. If it relates to any of the items, unions, paid leave, promotions, salary, wages, in that context, we should very well allow them to discuss that. So keep in mind, even for private employers, employees do have protected speech on some topics under federal law. Employees are legally allowed to discuss labor law issues if your employee suggests their coworker should vote for a certain candidate because they're going to raise minimum wage, then that speech is protected and you cannot shut it down. So again, important to understand gray areas. Now, there's no way to account for every workplace situation when it comes to employment and politics in the workplace laws. But walking in knowing your rights as an employer is very different than trying to diffuse a political argument when you don't know what you're legally allowed to say or do. So I would say research your state laws accordingly, okay? Now let's review some scenarios. Scenario number one, again, these are recent scenarios that we've actually had experience with through some of our clients or client contacts. So an employee wears a MAGA hat or All Lives Matter hat in the office, and a coworker asks her or him to remove it because he or she thinks political beliefs should be kept out of the workplace. Well, how should HR respond? Well, HR should first determine whether political beliefs, affiliation, or activity are protected category, the state or municipality where the business operates. If not, a company can set its own policy, but must be consistent in applying it. If hats and apparel are allowed, HR should remind employees to be tolerant and civil and be respectful towards the coworkers. Again, goes back to your policies, goes back to your state laws and the exclusions and LRA carve-outs, basically. Scenario number two, an employee is walking home from work and sees a group of LGBTQ rights protesters and recognizes a colleague in the group. The next day, he or she tells several coworkers what she saw, which prompts the protester to complain to HR. How should HR respond? Well, the protester is really free to engage in such activity outside of work, and the employee walking home is also free to discuss it with colleagues. HR should monitor the situation to see if it leads to any harassment or inappropriate commentary. HR should also make sure no related conversation at work involves religion, gender, pregnancy, or other legally protected categories. So this leads to our next topic. Does HR need to manage or monitor workplace political discussions? Before we run into the next topic of that, I did want to bring up the whole city and state laws to consider that I just covered. So again, acknowledging that politics exist doesn't mean opening up the office floor for debate. However, complying with National Labor Relations Act requirements, which we just covered, you want to come up with a plan to address the political discussions at the workplace. So again, all plans start with the policy, and here's some of the state regulations to keep in mind as you draft them. Again, always check with your legal counsel based on locations you operate, and not just where you have an office, but the actual operational facilities, meaning they're working out in the field and they have to come back to a home satellite office. Just keep those type of things in mind as well. Now, further, some jurisdictions have laws protecting employees' political expression. So that's something we'll cover as well. So in California, Colorado, Guam, Louisiana, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, Nevada, South Carolina, Utah, and West Virginia, as well as cities of Seattle and Madison, Wisconsin, they prohibit employers from retaliating against employees for engaging in political activities. Again, political activities is in quotes because it's an umbrella term. So that can mean anything from voting, lobbying for a candidate, passing out flyers, peaceful protests, other types of political activities such as fundraising for them. So keep in mind, we just covered some states and some cities as well. Now, New Mexico also protects employees' right to express political opinions. So again, if they get on Facebook, or LinkedIn and they are expressing political opinions, New Mexico is one that allows them to do so. So again, I could have a Texas employee working in New Mexico. How does that work out for me when I draft my policies? Now, Illinois, Iowa, Louisiana, New York, Puerto Rico, Utah, and the U.S. Virgin Islands and Washington, D.C., as well as Broward County, Florida, and Urbana in Illinois specifically prohibit employers from discriminating against employees based on party membership or for engaging in election-related speech and political activities. So these are all just broad spectrums, but again, check with your legal counsel. Now, what that does mean is that in Texas, again, it's an at-will state. If somebody's a registered party or a registered, party to vote in a certain type of party, then could they essentially be discriminated against? Yes, again, back to your policies and to your company culture and how to manage some of those items. Now, this is kind of an important one. I think so far we've kind of led to the topic of, do we want to create a policy or not have a policy, right? Now, if you are going to do a policy, the execution is setting the parameters and guidelines on employee speech as a private employer. Remember that you have the right to do so around political discussions and activities of the workplace. I do recommend that you detail the exact behaviors that are prohibited in your workplace, including forbidding political discussions during work hours, work locations. Now, this restriction again includes soliciting contributions or support for political figures or causes. You can also bar employees from using the company's name or affiliation connection to political or campaign activities. The key is to have neutral policies, and also consistent policies, right? Avoid statements that single out certain political views or language that indicates favoritism to a specific political leaning, unless you intend to hire, manage, and enforce a policy with a particular political agenda. Again, in this case, make sure that you're hitting state and local laws. So 1, update your employee handbook to outline company rules and expectations in a comprehensive manner with a zero tolerance policy on intimidation or discrimination. 2, consistently enforce a policy. Ensure that all employees are treated equally and in a way that doesn't interfere with workplace productivity. I always love to tie my policies back into workplace productivity because ultimately, in any business, that is the #1 driver, right? So if you can frame your policies to enforce that, and that is the culture you want to enforce, then you are kind of standing on neutral ground, which is what I would recommend. 3rd, have an acknowledgement page. Again, cover your bases. Have the employees sign an acknowledgement that they received and understood the policy. Now that we have an idea as to how you want to approach these political discussions at work, the question now is, do you really need a policy from scratch? I would recommend that you review your current policies and update them accordingly, right? Now, these can include an overlap. So parts of your codes of professional conduct and dress code, which you can include on political apparel, harassment and bullying, discrimination retaliation policy, non-solicitation policy, or use of company equipment and technology, communication, interpersonal relations, and also diversity and inclusion. So in a nutshell, don't worry about starting something from scratch. If you've got some of these policies already going, find a way to incorporate the no political discussion, parameters within those policies. So a really, really good question came up earlier this week regarding how an HR professional should monitor political discussion in the workplace if no one has lodged a formal complaint. I mean, it's kind of a fair question. If no one has come forward and said, I have been discriminated or harassed, how do you identify the ticking time bombs? Do you need to identify the ticking time bombs? So do you need to identify them? The answer is yes, because it's always about protecting the company. You don't want to open yourself up for legal repercussions or issues. 2, how do you identify them? So this is something I'm going to cover shortly. So again, HR is not in the policing business. However, there's some recommendations on what you and your managers can do to kind of identify the ticking time bombs, right? So my favorite thing to do is what I would call a pulse check, which is something I've done in the past, and I still continue to do, which is staying engaged with your team and see what they're talking about. Walk around the office periodically, walk the floors, walk the different facilities. Get out of the office and see what you're feeling out there. What's the vibe out there? Now, if you hear a political conversation in progress, politely yet firmly remind your employees that they're off task and that these discussions belong outside the workplace. When I say outside the workplace, let me rephrase that. Outside the workplace as in outside the workplace without, not engaging in with coworkers, basically. Take it to the family, take it to your friends at home. But if necessary, remind them that we all have different beliefs and it's okay to agree to disagree. Now, don't wait until the conversation becomes aggressive, disrespectful, threatening, or even worse, like physical, right? You don't want that. Now, set a good example from leadership on down by adhering to no politics rules while in the workplace. Like, don't make jokes about controversial topics, avoid discussing politics with subordinates, even if you share the same beliefs. Now, don't react to others' derogatory comments or jokes either about protective factors. This means that you should immediately let the offending party know that behavior is unacceptable in your workplace and put a stop to it. Last but not least, I recommend you do routine training with leaders to recognize signs of potential discrimination and harassment. Keep doing your diversity and inclusion trainings, and I recommend you do it on a quarterly basis or biannual basis at the very least. If they're in a management role, they have clearly an hour to 2 that we need to make sure they set aside for such issues that come up. Now, if you're wondering what to include in zero tolerance policy, I've put together some examples for you, right? We don't want to just say, hey, there's a tolerance policy, but then not explain what are some examples they should not be doing. Some of the examples you can include in your handbook or policy are sending emails of a political nature on company computers and using a company email address to other employees, customers, or industry partners. Wearing political or campaign attire to work, or decorating one's office or cubicle with political or campaign messaging not protected under the National Labor Relations Act. So again, come back to where your parameters are and make sure that you message it correctly. Conversations between employees and work premises about political topics not protected under NLRA, or soliciting or campaigning on work premises. So these are some major, bullet point items that cover as you draft your policies, right? Now, if all else fails, meaning all your effort to maintain a neutral and discrimination-free workforce with all the policies and procedures and training you've put in place for yourself, your managers, and you still have a sticky situation on your hands with a politically centered conflict, right? HR is always full of surprises, so it's not like we haven't heard of such situations happening, even though you have done everything, including your pulse checks. Now proceed with the following, okay? 1, remain neutral. Any body language or words that appear that you're taking sides of the party or say anything that can escalate the issue, just refrain from it. You do not want to project any viewpoints or share any biases. Now is not the time to take a stance as it defeats the whole purpose of being neutral in the situation. So even if you strongly feel towards one belief versus the other, now it's not the time when you are finding yourself in this situation. 2, de-escalate the situation by immediately separating the parties and cease the discussion. Involve a management team where necessary to corroborate the discussion and document it with HR. 3, review your policy of the parties and remind them that repeat offenses won't be tolerated, right? What that means is if your first time, any offense across the board, it's a write-up, second is a termination. Follow through if these repeat instances occur. Don't open yourself up for liability by choosing sides or parties. Now is not the time to do that. We've already mentioned no politics at the workplace, right? So keep in mind, don't neglect to train supervisors and managers what to do when they hear or observe inappropriate workplace conduct, right? Don't discipline opinions. Instead, be the mediator of disruptions. So focus on the way employees express themselves and how it affects coworkers and not what they're expressing. Don't worry about the content, because content is not where we want to get ourselves wrapped up into. I would rather we focus on how they're expressing themselves and what the policy is asking them to adhere to. Don't allow the use of your company's name or affiliation connection with a personal political activity that written approval. It goes back to your social media policy. Make sure to include those in there. Don't encourage employees to take the conversation outside if they want to continue the debate. Now, this is my biggest takeaway of one thing. I hear this a lot from managers where they say, well, I just told the guys or girls to take it outside if they want to continue the conversation. We think, or they think, that they've dismissed the issue, when in fact, do not ever do that, because discrimination or harassment claims aren't necessarily limited to the workplace if several employees are engaged in negative conversations off premise. So asking them to take it outside, not the best way to do it. As I mentioned earlier, hey, take it home, talk to friends, family, nothing related to coworkers or the workplace during work hours or work premises. That would be the cleanest way to ensure that you are fully protecting the company. So I hope that today's session is really helpful. So we're actually wrapping up today's session, and we'll begin addressing any questions that you have. So we just had a question come up whether this webinar is being recorded. The answer is yes. We can send you a copy of this recording, and it will be actually available to you on LinkedIn and YouTube as well, and our company website too, if I believe. Another question that we had is NLRA carve-outs, how to specifically frame them in a policy. As I mentioned earlier, the NLRA carve-outs specifically relate to the 4 to 5 bullet points about topics regarding pay increases, promotions, the liberty to unionize. So if you want to outline those 4 bullet points and say these are the premises in which we will allow you to bring up a political discussion, you can outline that and say anything else is off limits. So I would recommend that if you want to specify how the carve-outs are done, those would be the bullet points. I would say, hey, we have zero tolerance policy except for these exclusions here, and frame that into your policy. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have. I want to thank you, each and every one of you, for attending today. If you ever need any help, we're just a click away. We can be reached at info@clickonhr.com and 1-833-CLICK-HR. Also follow us on our social media platforms if you're not already doing so. And thank you and have a great day.